You are welcomed, very quietly, to this lecture that has been prepared without urgency, without intensity, and without any intention to stimulate. It is not a lecture designed to keep you awake, but rather a lecture that is meant to provide a soft and steady background, a background of simple information, of small facts, of repetitive description, so that your body may become calm, your breathing may slow, and your mind may gradually allow itself to wander. It is not necessary to focus sharply on every word. It is not necessary to remember. It is not necessary to analyze. It is only necessary to listen, if listening is comfortable, or to allow the sound of words to move past you if drifting away is more comfortable. The subject of this long and quiet talk is the survival of frontier families during the coldest nights of winter. It is a subject without drama. It is a subject without spectacle. It is a subject that can be approached through many small details, all of them repetitive, all of them similar, and all of them lacking excitement. In these small details, the rhythm of survival can be observed. The rhythm was ordinary, the rhythm was constant, and the rhythm was repeated each night, each week, and each season. You will hear about the ways in which cabins were built, with logs stacked and gaps filled. You will hear about the ways in which fires were made, with kindling, with wood, with ashes preserved for morning. You will hear about the ways in which clothing was layered, with wool, with linen, with leather, with skins, with anything that could be used. You will hear about food, about storage, about simple meals that carried warmth inside the body. You will hear about bedding, about quilts, about straw and feathers, about children sleeping side by side. You will hear about water carried indoors, animals tended before dark, neighbors visiting, and long nights passed in silence. Each part of this topic can be told slowly. Each part of this topic. It was often observed, and it has been written many times in diaries, records, and recollections, that the homes of frontier families were simple, modest, and practical. They were not built for beauty, they were not built for grandeur, and they were not built for ornament. They were built for function. And the most basic function was protection from the elements. Protection from wind. Protection from snow. Protection from the biting cold that came during the deepest months of winter. The structure of cabins was therefore designed, in its own plain way, to help families survive the coldest nights. Most frontier cabins were built of logs. The logs were taken from nearby forests, because transportation was difficult and costly. The trees were cut, stripped of their bark, and stacked horizontally. The method was not always neat. The logs were not always uniform. Some were thicker, some were thinner, and this produced gaps. The gaps were inevitable. It was quickly discovered that without filling the gaps, wind entered, snow entered, and cold entered. Therefore, the process of filling the gaps was repeated for every cabin. This filling was called chinking. It was done with clay, with mud, with moss, with whatever materials could be found. The work was not done once, but many times. Because chinking dried out, chinking crumbled, and chinking fell away. It was observed that each winter, chinking had to be repaired again, and again, and again. This repetitive task was accepted. It was considered ordinary. It was not remarkable, only necessary. The walls of the cabins, once chinked, provided insulation. It was not perfect insulation. It was not the same as later materials. But it was insulation enough to make the difference between bitter cold and manageable cold. Inside, the walls kept the wind from blowing directly. Inside, the walls kept snow from drifting across the floor. And it was recognized that even the smallest barrier improved survival. The roofs of cabins were also functional. Often they were built of wooden shingles. Sometimes they were covered with simple boards. Snow would fall on these roofs in heavy amounts. Instead of removing all of the snow, families sometimes left the snow in place. The snow itself became an insulating layer. The snow pressed down on the roof, sealing cracks. It was noticed that cabins sometimes stayed warmer with a layer of snow upon them than without it. Thus, the snow, which was usually seen as hardship, became a small form of help. Cabins often had only one room. The single-room design was not considered a luxury. It was considered efficient. With only one room, heat from the fire could spread across the entire space. With only one room, families could sleep close together. With only one room, doors and windows were minimized, and fewer openings meant fewer drafts. It was repeated in many accounts that one-room cabins were easier to heat. Larger cabins required more wood, more effort, and more tending of the fire. Thus, the single-room design, though small, was practical for cold nights. The windows of frontier cabins were few. Sometimes there was only one. Sometimes there were none. Glass was expensive and rare. If glass was not available, oiled paper might be used, or shutters might be closed entirely. Light was reduced, but warmth was preserved. The absence of windows reduced the entry of wind. It reduced the loss of heat. And families accepted dim interiors if it meant surviving cold nights. The floors of cabins were also important. In some cases, the floor was simply the earth itself, beaten flat and packed hard. In other cases, wooden planks were laid. It was understood that cold rose from the ground. Therefore, families covered the floor with straw, with rushes, or with rugs if rugs could be obtained. Each layer reduced the loss of warmth from feet and bedding. This layering was repeated often, changed often, and refreshed often. Because straw became dirty, and rushes wore out. The repetition was tedious, but necessary. The doors of cabins were heavy and simple. They were made of wood, fastened with iron nails or wooden pegs. When night came, the doors were closed firmly. Blankets might be hung over the inside of doors to reduce drafts. Any small crack might allow cold air to seep in, so blankets were common barriers. It was understood that even a slight draft, repeated hour after hour, could make the difference between comfort and discomfort. Thus, doors were managed carefully. Chimneys were another essential feature. Cabins needed chimneys for fireplaces, and chimneys were often built of stone or of clay. If stones were available, they were stacked, with mortar or mud between them. If stones were scarce, chimneys might be fashioned from clay and sticks. These clay chimneys were fragile, and they sometimes cracked. When they cracked, cold entered, and repairs were needed. Thus, chimneys were both a necessity and a constant source of work. Families accepted this. It was a repeated burden of the season. It should be remembered that frontier cabins were not uniform. They differed by region. They differed by material. They differed by the skill of the builder. Yet in every case, the goal was the same. To create a shelter that kept out the worst of the cold. To create a shelter that allowed fires to be built inside. To create a shelter where families could endure long nights together. In conclusion, the structure of frontier cabins was plain, repetitive, and functional. Logs were cut. Logs were stacked. Gaps were filled. Roofs were covered. Snow became insulation. Windows were few. Floors were layered. Doors were shut. Chimneys were patched. And all of this was done not for comfort, not for luxury, but for survival. The same actions were repeated every season. The same repairs were made each year. The same small details mattered again and again. It was understood, by nearly every frontier family, that the fire was the center of survival during winter nights. Without fire there was little warmth. Without fire there was no cooking. Without fire there was no light. Thus, the fireplace or stove was the most important feature inside the cabin, and the care of that fireplace or stove was a matter of daily repetition. In the earliest cabins, fireplaces were built wide and deep. They were constructed from stone if stone was available. If stone was not available, clay or mud was used, though clay cracked more easily. The fireplace was not merely a place for fire. It was also a place for cooking, for drying clothing, and for gathering. It was both useful and inefficient. Much heat rose upward through the chimney and escaped into the sky. It was observed that in many cabins, the area near the fire was warm, but the corners of the room remained cold. Still, the fireplace was the best tool that could be built with the resources at hand. The process of building and maintaining fire was repetitive. Kindling had to be gathered. Small sticks were collected, usually by children. Larger logs were cut and split, usually by adults. The logs were stacked in piles outdoors. If covered, they stayed drier. If uncovered, they were snowed upon, and snow had to be brushed away. Day after day, wood was carried in. Night after night, the fire was fed. The rhythm did not change. It was steady, it was predictable, it was required. Banking the fire was another repeated practice. At night, before sleeping, the embers were covered with ash. This ash preserved the heat. In the morning, when families rose, the coals still glowed beneath the ash. New wood could be placed upon them, and the fire sprang back to life. If the fire went out completely, flint and steel had to be struck, or embers borrowed from a neighbor. It was noted that families took care not to let the fire die, for relighting was slow and difficult. Thus, the practice of banking coals was part of every evening routine. Later, iron stoves became more common. These stoves were heavy, costly, and durable. They were brought westward when families had the means. Unlike fireplaces, stoves radiated heat more evenly. The iron grew hot and spread warmth across the room. Cooking surfaces were flat, so pots could be set directly on top. Less wood was used, more heat was retained, and families began to prefer stoves. Still, not every cabin had one. Some families never owned a stove. Others owned only small stoves, insufficient for larger cabins. Yet when a stove was present, it changed the rhythm of the household. The room grew warmer, and nights grew less bitter. Fireplaces and stoves also provided light. The flames illuminated cabins faintly. By this light, sewing was done, tools were mended, and meals were prepared. By this light, stories were told, not dramatic stories, but ordinary accounts of daily work. The fire provided comfort in its consistency. The sound of crackling wood, repeated each evening, became familiar. The glow of embers, steady and unchanging, became part of the rhythm of winter. It is important to note that fire also produced smoke. Chimneys carried smoke upward, but chimneys were not always perfect. Sometimes smoke leaked back into the room. This smoke irritated eyes, darkened walls, and coated ceilings. Still, families accepted it. Smoke was better than cold. The presence of smoke was another ordinary feature of cabin life, accepted as part of survival. The gathering of fuel for fires was endless. Each log burned down to ash. Each log had to be replaced. Wood piles shrank each week. If wood ran low, more had to be cut. This cutting was done even in snow, even in wind, even in bitter weather. It was never optional. It was simply repeated, because it had to be repeated. The rhythm of chopping, stacking, and carrying wood was as much a part of winter as the fire itself. Children often remembered the tasks of carrying wood into the cabin. Small arms carried small bundles. Older children carried larger loads. This work was constant. No day passed without the carrying of wood. Evening meant adding wood to the fire. Morning meant reviving the embers with wood. The cycle continued endlessly until spring. This monotony was part of life, and it was accepted. Clothing, too, was dried by the fire. Wet mittens were hung near it. Damp shoes were placed beside it. Snow-covered coats were thawed and dried. Sometimes steam rose from these garments, filling the cabin. It was a simple scene, repeated every evening. Without the fire, clothing would have remained wet and cold. With the fire, it became wearable again. Thus, the fireplace or stove did more than heat the air, it preserved clothing and kept tools serviceable. Cooking was equally dependent on fire. Beans simmered in iron pots. Cornbread baked in Dutch ovens. Salt pork sizzled in pans. The smells of such meals filled cabins each night. They were not luxurious meals, but they were warm meals, and warmth was valued more than flavor. The fire made these meals possible. Without it, food could not be softened, and cold food provided less comfort. Thus, every evening meal was tied directly to the fire. The fireplace or stove was not only the center of warmth, but the center of family life. Chairs were drawn near it. Beds were placed close to it when possible. Conversations occurred around it. And as the night lengthened, the fire was watched carefully. Logs were added slowly. Ashes were shifted gently. And when sleep finally came, the embers glowed, lasting until morning. To summarize, fireplaces and stoves were the heart of winter survival. They were built carefully. They were fed constantly. They were maintained daily. And they were never ignored. Through fire, warmth was sustained. Through fire, food was prepared. Through fire, clothing was dried. Through fire, the coldest nights were endured. The same practices were repeated each evening and each morning. Firewood was gathered. Kindling was carried. Embers were banked. Ashes were cleared. Logs were split. Meals were cooked. Garments were dried. Families gathered close. The rhythm was unchanging. The rhythm was survival. It was recognized, across many settlements and across many households, that warmth could not depend upon walls and roofs alone. The body itself required layers, coverings, and fabrics that reduced the loss of heat. It was therefore common that attention was given to clothing and to bedding, two aspects of frontier life that were never considered extravagant but always considered necessary. Clothing was not purchased frequently. It was often produced within the home, from fibers that had been spun and woven by hand. Wool was regarded as the most reliable material. Sheep were valued not only for meat but for fleece. The wool, once sheared, was washed, carded, spun, and woven. This process consumed weeks of work, yet the result was fabric that held warmth even when damp. Woolen garments were heavy, but heavy garments were accepted because they preserved heat. Linen was another fabric, though linen did not insulate as strongly. Linen was produced from flax. The stalks of flax plants were rent, broken, scutched, and hackled until long fibers appeared. These fibers were spun and woven into cloth. Linen was often used for undergarments, shirts, and lighter layers. In winter, linen was placed beneath wool. It absorbed moisture, while wool retained warmth. This layering was practiced deliberately, repeated by many households in the same fashion. Leather was also common. Hides from deer, elk, or cattle were tanned and shaped into jackets, breeches, and shoes. The tanning process required patience. Skins were soaked, scraped, and treated with natural tannins. The resulting leather was stiff at first but softened with use. Leather did not provide the same warmth as wool, but it blocked wind, and for that reason it was worn on the outer layer. Head coverings were emphasized. It was observed that much heat was lost through the head, and thus caps, hoods, and coifs were worn indoors as well as outdoors. Wool caps were knitted, sometimes roughly, but they served their function. Children wore nightcaps to bed, a habit regarded as entirely ordinary. Hands and feet were especially vulnerable. Mittens, often made from wool, were preferred over gloves, because a mitten enclosed the fingers together and preserved more heat. Shoes were simple, sometimes made of rawhide, sometimes of leather, and often lined with scraps of cloth. Stockings were knitted from wool, repaired repeatedly when holes appeared. Extra stockings were prized. Without them, frostbite threatened toes, and once frostbite occurred, recovery was uncertain. Bedding was equally significant. Families placed great value on quilts, blankets, and mattresses. Quilts were pieced from scraps of cloth, sewn into patterns more by necessity than by design. The inner layers of quilts were filled with batting, often wool or cotton if available, or sometimes rags when no better material could be found. These quilts were heavy, and the heaviness itself provided comfort. Feather beds were considered especially valuable. When feathers could be collected, they were sewn into ticking and used as mattresses. These feather beds retained warmth by trapping air. They were softer than straw and longer lasting. Not every household could afford a feather bed, and where feathers were scarce, straw mattresses were common. Straw was cut, dried, and packed into ticking. The straw compressed over time, so mattresses were emptied and refilled seasonally. This task was not glamorous, yet it was necessary. Children usually shared beds. Brothers slept beside brothers, sisters beside sisters, or sometimes all together if space required. Body heat was shared unconsciously, reducing the chill. Parents slept close as well, sometimes in the same room as children, sometimes even in the same bed. Privacy was rare, but warmth was preserved. Blankets were layered. It was common to place the heaviest covering on top, pressing down lighter blankets beneath. Animal skins, such as bear or buffalo hides, were used when available. These hides were draped over bedding and provided additional insulation. In especially harsh conditions, every available textile, from cloaks to coats to spare clothing, was added to the bed. Nightwear was practical. People did not change into light garments for sleep. Instead, much of the day's clothing was retained. Shirts were kept on, stockings remained, and caps were pulled down over ears. The goal was not comfort in the modern sense but endurance through cold hours. Textiles required maintenance. Holes were patched, seams resewn, tiers mended. Mothers and daughters spent winter evenings repairing garments by lamplight. Worn stockings were darned with wool thread, and frayed quilts were stitched again. Nothing was discarded until it could no longer be repaired. The scarcity of fabric forced thrift. Each patch upon a garment was accepted, not criticized. The supply of textiles also depended on trade. In some regions, neighbors exchanged cloth, yarn, or hides. Traders brought bolts of calico, lengths of wool, or pieces of flannel, though prices were often high. Families weighed whether to purchase or to continue relying upon homespun materials. When new fabric entered a home, it was used with care. Nothing was wasted. Even the smallest scraps were saved for quilts or patches. It was not unusual for bedding arrangements to change with the season. In autumn, lighter coverings were used. As nights grew longer, heavier quilts were added. By midwinter, every available textile was employed. Beds were moved closer to the fire when space permitted, though sparks were always a risk. Care was taken to keep blankets away from open flames, but warmth was valued over safety. Cleanliness was considered, though it was difficult. Straw mattresses were emptied to remove vermin. Quilts were beaten outdoors on rare sunny days. Garments were washed in cold water, scrubbed on boards, and dried by the fire. Soap was made from lye and animal fat, harsh but effective. The washing process was laborious, so garments were worn many times between washings. In many recollections, families spoke of the weight of quilts pressing down, of the sound of straw rustling beneath, of the dim glow of embers across the room, and of the faint scratch of wool against skin. These details were not unusual. They were shared across regions, repeated across generations. In conclusion, the clothing and bedding of frontier families were not luxuries but necessities. Wool was spun, linen was woven, hides were tanned, quilts were pieced, feathers were gathered, straw was stuffed, stockings were knitted, and garments were patched. Each action served a single purpose: to hold warmth close to the body through the longest nights. The repetition of these tasks defined winter life. Fiber was spun, fabric was woven, garments were sewn, bedding was filled, patches were applied, and stitches were made again and again. Nothing about the process was swift. Nothing about the process was decorative. Yet without these simple materials and steady practices, the coldest nights could not have been endured. It was recognized by those who lived on the frontier that the warmth of the body depended not only upon clothing or upon shelter but also upon the steady intake of food. Food provided fuel, and fuel created energy, and energy created heat. The connection between diet and warmth was understood without scientific explanation. It was a matter of daily experience. When meals were eaten, strength was maintained. When meals were missed, cold seemed more intense. Therefore, food was prepared carefully, stored carefully, and consumed carefully during the long nights of winter. The foods that were available were not numerous. They were determined by what had been grown in the summer, what had been hunted in the autumn, and what could be preserved for later months. Grains such as corn and wheat were central. Cornmeal was especially common. It was ground, sifted, and stored in barrels. From cornmeal came porridge, mush, and bread. These dishes were plain, but they provided steady energy. Wheat, when available, was ground into flour, though flour was more often scarce on the frontier. When flour was obtained, it was saved for special uses such as bread for Sundays or biscuits on holidays. Beans were another staple. Beans were dried after harvest and stored in sacks or jars. Dried beans lasted through the winter without spoiling. They were boiled in kettles, sometimes for hours, until they softened. Beans provided protein, and protein sustained warmth. Families often added bits of salt pork to beans, creating a dish that appeared in many households. It was not luxurious, but it was filling, and filling food was valued most. Salt pork itself was one of the most dependable preserved meats. Pigs were slaughtered in the autumn, and the meat was packed in barrels of salt. The salt drew out moisture and prevented decay. When meat was needed, pieces were removed, rinsed, and cooked. Pork was greasy, but grease was not regarded as unpleasant. Grease meant energy. Grease meant warmth. In some regions, lard was stored in crocks and used for cooking throughout the winter. Other meats were also preserved. Venison was dried into jerky. Fish were sometimes salted or smoked. Beef was less common, but when cattle were slaughtered, beef was also salted. Smoking sheds were built where meat hung above slow fires, absorbing smoke and drying over days. This meat kept for months if protected from dampness. Vegetables were harder to keep. Root vegetables such as potatoes, turnips, and carrots were stored in cellars. Cellars were dug below cabins or near them. They stayed cool but not freezing. Vegetables lasted longer underground. When needed, they were brought up, peeled, and boiled. Cabbage was sometimes fermented into sauerkraut, preserved in barrels. Pumpkins and squash, if stored dry, lasted into the winter. These vegetables provided vitamins, though the word vitamin was not yet used. Families simply knew that without vegetables, sickness increased. Dairy products were less reliable in winter. Cows gave less milk, and sometimes no milk at all when feed was scarce. Cheese was therefore prepared in the autumn and stored for later. Hard cheese lasted longest. Butter was churned and salted, then kept cool. In deep winter, butter often hardened so much that knives struggled to cut it. Still, it was used, melted near the fire before meals. Food preservation required planning. Families worked through summer and autumn to prepare for winter. Corn was dried, beans were shelled, pork was salted, jars were filled, and cellars were stocked. If preparation was sufficient, winter could be endured without hunger. If preparation failed, hardship was certain. Hunger and cold often came together, and both threatened survival. Meals were prepared slowly, often over many hours. A kettle might hang above the fire all day, filled with beans, pork, or root vegetables. The heat of cooking spread into the room, adding a small measure of warmth. The smell of food was steady, familiar, and comforting. Bread was baked in Dutch ovens, covered with coals. Cornbread was baked in pans, crust forming on the outside while the inside remained soft. These processes were repeated daily, not for novelty but for necessity. It was noticed that heavier foods created warmth that lasted. Fatty meats, butter, and breads provided long energy. Sweet foods were rare, though molasses appeared in some households. Molasses was thick, stored in jugs, and used sparingly. Sugar, when available, was treasured, but often it was scarce. Honey appeared in some regions, gathered in warm months and saved for cold ones. Sweetness was pleasant, but more importantly, it was energy. Water was consumed as well, but water in winter often froze. Families brought buckets of water inside before night. If left outside, ice formed, and ice could not be easily broken in darkness. Warm drinks were prepared when possible. Milk, when warm, was consumed quickly. Weak tea, made from imported leaves or from local herbs, was sometimes drunk before bed. Even hot water, plain and without addition, was sipped to warm the body. Utensils for eating were simple. Wooden bowls, iron spoons, pewter plates, and tin cups were used again and again. Food was not wasted. Scraps were eaten, bones were boiled for broth, and fat was saved for cooking. The goal was not variety but sustenance. The repetition of meals was accepted. The sameness was tolerated. It was not considered dull, it was considered survival. Children were taught to eat all that was placed before them. Complaints were few, because alternatives were few. Leftovers were rare, but when they existed, they were kept close to the hearth to prevent freezing. Food left too far from warmth became solid, difficult to eat, and unpleasant to thaw. Therefore, food was managed with care, just as firewood and clothing were managed. Evening meals were important. After the day's work, families gathered for the main meal. This meal provided the energy needed to last through the night. Smaller snacks might be eaten before sleep, simply to maintain warmth. It was observed that those who went to bed hungry often felt colder. Those who went to bed full endured more comfortably. This principle shaped the rhythm of winter evenings. The presence of food also created a sense of stability. To see barrels filled with cornmeal, jars filled with beans, crocks filled with lard, and shelves lined with root vegetables was to feel secure. To see these supplies diminish too quickly was to feel uneasy. Thus, the sight of food, as well as the taste of food, provided warmth. In conclusion, the relationship between food and warmth was steady and clear. Grains were stored, beans were boiled, pork was salted, vegetables were cellared, butter was churned, cheese was hardened, and meals were eaten with purpose. Each dish was plain, each dish was functional, each dish provided fuel. Without food, fire alone could not keep families warm. Without food, clothing alone could not preserve heat. It was food, consumed regularly, that allowed bodies to resist the cold. And so, each winter repeated the same cycle. Crops were planted, harvested, dried, and stored. Animals were slaughtered, salted, and preserved. Meals were prepared, shared, and eaten. Hunger was avoided when planning succeeded. Warmth was maintained when food was sufficient. The rhythm of eating, steady and repetitive, formed one of the quiet foundations of survival during the coldest night. It was observed that the approach of night on the frontier was not treated with surprise but with steady preparation. The setting of the sun was expected, and the cold that followed was anticipated. Families learned, over many seasons, that each evening required the same sequence of tasks, carried out in much the same order, carried out with much the same results. This rhythm of preparation gave structure to the hours before sleep, and it ensured that survival was not left to chance. As daylight weakened, outdoor work was brought to a close. Tools were gathered and placed under cover. Axes were leaned against walls, saws were stored on hooks, and buckets were set upside down so that frost would not fill them. Livestock was checked. Cows were led into sheds or stables, sheep were guided into pens, chickens were closed safely in coops. The closing of doors and latches was performed each evening, not dramatically, but consistently, because animals provided food, milk, wool, and protection. To lose animals to cold or predators was to reduce survival. Therefore, animal care was always part of the evening routine. Water was fetched before nightfall. Buckets were filled at wells, streams, or springs, then carried into cabins. This habit prevented the need to break ice in darkness. A bucket of water placed near the hearth remained usable. Without this habit, thirst or cooking difficulty could occur. Therefore, water carrying was not delayed. It was repeated every afternoon, so regularly that it became part of the rhythm of the day. Fires were attended to as light diminished. Embers were shifted, kindling was added, larger logs were arranged. If a stove was present, its door was opened briefly to insert wood, then shut again. The sound of crackling filled the cabin. This was not remarkable. It was routine. Without fire, warmth faded quickly. With fire, warmth remained steady. Therefore, the tending of fire was never neglected in the hours before night. Inside the cabin, small tasks were performed to reduce drafts. Shutters were closed, blankets hung across doorways, rugs adjusted along floorboards, and gaps filled with cloth or paper. These actions reduced the entry of cold air. None of these actions were remarkable. All were ordinary. All were expected. Meals were prepared during these same hours. The evening meal, larger than the midday meal, gave energy for the night. Beans simmered in kettles, bread baked in ovens, and meat boiled or fried. The smell spread across the cabin. Children waited, parents stirred, and plates were set upon tables. The eating of this meal marked the transition from day to night. It was followed by the cleaning of dishes, the saving of leftovers, and the placing of food near the hearth so that it would not freeze. Each family repeated this sequence in nearly identical fashion. After eating, clothing was adjusted. Garments that were damp from snow or sweat were removed, dried by the fire, and replaced with dry garments if such garments were available. Wool socks were pulled higher, caps were placed firmly, mittens hung nearby to dry. The adjustment of clothing was part of the preparation for bed, though it occurred well before sleep. Children were directed toward chores in the final hours of light. Some carried in extra armfuls of wood so that the supply for the night would be close at hand. Others shook out straw from bedding, adding fresh layers if the old layers had flattened. Still others filled lamps with oil or trimmed candlewicks. These tasks were not considered optional. They were considered part of the day's close. Through such tasks, children learned discipline, and families secured their comfort for the long hours to come. The interior of the cabin grew quieter as darkness thickened. Lamps were lit if candles were available. Some households had only one lamp, placed in the center of the room. Around this faint light, final tasks were completed. Threads were spun, garments were mended, and tools were repaired. The sound of a needle through cloth, the sound of a whetstone on metal, the sound of quiet voices, all of these sounds filled the time between meal and bed. The mood was steady, not hurried. Families understood that nothing new could be accomplished once darkness came. Therefore, no attempt was made to begin large projects. Instead, only tasks suited to dim light were undertaken. The rhythm was predictable. The rhythm was repeated. Before bed, attention returned once more to the fire. Ash was drawn up over embers, coals were arranged so that they would survive until morning, and extra logs were placed within reach. If the fire was allowed to die completely, the morning would be colder, harder, and slower. Thus, the fire was treated with caution. Every evening, the fire was prepared not for the hours of wakefulness but for the hours of sleep. Beds were arranged. Quilts were shaken, straw smoothed, and blankets spread. Children climbed in first, often in groups, while parents ensured that coverings reached shoulders and feet. Caps were pulled down over ears, stockings pulled up over legs. Heavier coverings were added last, pressing the lighter ones beneath. In households with animals kept indoors, such as a calf, a lamb, or even chickens, extra warmth was gained. This practice, though inconvenient, was not unusual. Prayers were sometimes spoken, though often quietly. Words of gratitude for food, shelter, and warmth were said before lying down. This practice, while varied by family, added structure to the end of the day. It was a pause, a marker, and then silence resumed. The final moments before sleep were calm. Light was extinguished, leaving only the glow of embers. Sound diminished. The air was cold at the edges of the room but warmer near the center. Families settled into stillness. Sleep followed not suddenly but gradually, as bodies adjusted to the quiet and the warmth retained by quilts and clothing. To summarize, the daily routine before night was a sequence of small tasks. Animals were secured, water was fetched, wood was gathered, fires were tended, meals were eaten, clothes were dried, bedding was prepared, and lights were lowered. Each step was modest. Each step was necessary. None were ignored. This rhythm was repeated in countless cabins across countless evenings. The actions did not change. The order did not change. The purpose did not change. Through such routines, frontier families endured the coldest nights, not with ease, but with steady regularity. It was recognized that survival on the frontier was seldom an individual achievement. Although each family maintained its own cabin, its own tools, and its own supplies, the realities of winter made isolation dangerous. The cold was endured more effectively when families observed one another, when neighbors provided assistance, and when the principle of sharing was accepted as ordinary practice. In this way, survival was not only a matter of walls, fires, and food but also a matter of human connection. The frontier community was rarely large. A handful of cabins might be scattered along a road or near a river. The distance between them could be measured in miles, yet those miles were crossed when need arose. It was understood that no family could be certain of sufficient supplies, sufficient strength, or sufficient luck. Illness, accident, or miscalculation could reduce a household's chances. Therefore, reliance upon neighbors became a quiet but necessary part of the winter routine. Wood was one of the most frequently shared resources. A family with an abundance of cut logs sometimes provided a portion to a neighbor whose supply had diminished. This was not seen as charity in the modern sense. It was seen as mutual security. For if one household fell into crisis, others would be drawn into the same hardship. A cold cabin could not contribute to community tasks, and a family weakened by exposure might later require more serious aid. Thus, the lending of wood was practical, and it was repeated without ceremony. Food was also exchanged. If one family had beans in surplus, beans might be carried in a sack to a nearby cabin. If another household had slaughtered a pig, salted meat might be divided. When hunting was successful, venison might be shared with those who had less fortune. These exchanges were not documented as extraordinary. They were remembered as ordinary. They occurred quietly, with simple words, with few gestures, and with the understanding that reciprocity would occur when conditions reversed. Labor was shared as well. Heavy tasks, such as raising a barn, digging a well, or repairing a roof, could not be managed by one family alone. Even in winter, when such projects were rarer, there were moments when help was required. If snow collapsed a roof, neighbors were called. If illness struck the father of a family, neighbors carried water, cut wood, or tended animals. This was not questioned. It was the pattern of community life. Visiting itself was a form of survival. A neighbor arriving on snowshoes or with a sled brought news, reassurance, and human presence. Isolation was reduced, and spirits were steadied. The exchange of information, about weather, about animal tracks, about conditions in nearby settlements, was valuable. Even when no material goods were traded, the visit itself was useful. It confirmed that others were enduring the same season, performing the same routines, facing the same cold. Gatherings sometimes occurred despite the winter. Quilting bees, small church meetings, or shared meals might bring families together. These events required travel, often difficult in snow, yet they provided a rhythm that balanced solitude. The sharing of stories, even simple ones about daily work, was remembered. The words spoken were not dramatic. They were often about harvests, tools, repairs, or family health. Yet these words mattered. They reinforced continuity. Children were part of this pattern. When neighbors visited, children played together indoors, exchanging games or toys made of wood or cloth. Their laughter, though subdued in cold cabins, reminded parents that life continued. Older children sometimes carried messages between homes, walking short distances even in snow, delivering notes or spoken words. In this way, the young became part of the network of survival. Illness highlighted the importance of community. If someone became feverish or injured, neighbors brought herbs, broths, or experience. There were few doctors in remote areas, so knowledge was passed informally. A neighbor might know a remedy for coughs, another might know how to set a bone, another might have spare cloth for bandages. These contributions were not dismissed. They were integrated into the fabric of communal life. The borrowing and lending of tools also formed part of sharing. An axe might be lent, a saw borrowed, or a sled exchanged. Tools were expensive, and not every family possessed every item. Through lending, gaps were filled. Trust was required, and trust was built through repeated exchanges. Hospitality was extended when needed. A traveler caught in snow might be sheltered for the night. A family whose cabin was damaged might spend days or weeks with neighbors. Beds were crowded, food was stretched, but survival was prioritized. Accounts from the time mention such arrangements as unremarkable, because they were necessary. The role of women in sharing was pronounced. Women exchanged cloth, yarn, recipes, and remedies. They provided aid during childbirth and support during illness. They also organized gatherings such as quilting bees, which combined labor with companionship. Their efforts reinforced bonds that held communities together. Men shared in other ways. They cooperated in hunting parties, timber cutting, and defense against threats. They assisted in hauling heavy loads, mending fences, or rescuing livestock from snowdrifts. These acts were not optional. They were expected, for any man could one day require the same help. Religious observances also played a role. Even in winter, when travel was difficult, sermons or prayers were sometimes shared. The spiritual element of community was not separate from survival. It reminded families that their efforts were part of a larger rhythm, and it encouraged patience through long seasons. It should be remembered that sharing was not limitless. Families could not give what they did not have. When supplies were scarce for all, generosity diminished. Yet even then, gestures of assistance continued. A cup of beans, a few sticks of wood, a blanket lent for one night, these small acts carried weight. The pattern of community was therefore built upon repetition. Families observed one another. Supplies were exchanged. Labor was shared. Visits were made. Children carried messages. Tools were borrowed. Remedies were provided. Beds were offered. Meals were divided. Gatherings were held. And when conditions changed, these same acts occurred again. To summarize, the survival of frontier families through the coldest nights was not only a matter of private cabins and private fires. It was also a matter of neighbors who gave, received, and supported one another. This sharing was not dramatic. It was not recorded in headlines. It was ordinary, expected, and repeated. It was the steady rhythm of community life. It was observed that the survival of frontier families during long winters depended not only on the efforts of adults but also on the steady participation of children. Children were not considered bystanders. They were integrated into the rhythm of work from an early age, and their labor, though smaller in scale, was essential to the daily routine. The coldest nights were endured more securely when children accepted their roles and performed them faithfully. The assignment of chores began early. A child of 5 or 6 might already be expected to carry small objects, to sweep, or to fetch. The work was scaled to ability, but ability was not underestimated. Parents knew that each pair of hands, no matter how small, contributed to survival. Thus, the education of children in chores was not postponed. It began as soon as children could walk steadily, hold objects firmly, and follow instructions. Carrying water was one of the earliest responsibilities. Buckets were heavy, but smaller vessels were given to younger children. They fetched water from the well or from the spring and brought it into the cabin. This task was performed daily and was especially important before nightfall, when ice could form. The repetition of this chore trained children in endurance, balance, and patience. Feeding animals was another common task. Chickens required grain scattered before dusk. Cows required hay placed near troughs. Sheep required gates secured. These duties were often given to children, who learned to handle animals calmly. The connection between animal care and family survival was explained gradually. Children were told that without chickens, eggs would vanish, without cows, milk would disappear, without sheep, wool would not be available. Thus, each act of feeding or fastening was linked to the larger rhythm of endurance. Gathering straw was a task often suited to children. Straw was brought into the cabin to refresh bedding or to cover floors. A child could carry armfuls, drop them upon the mattress, and spread them evenly. Though the work seemed minor, it added to comfort. Fresh straw reduced dampness and odors. The knowledge that children had contributed to warmth encouraged them to continue. Tending lamps and candles was another responsibility. Wicks required trimming, oil required pouring, and candles required placement. Older children were trusted with these tasks, for fire was dangerous, yet essential. The ability to handle flame cautiously was taught by parents with careful instruction. The glow of a trimmed lamp was therefore often the result of a child's steady hand. Inside the cabin, sweeping was frequent. Snow, dirt, and straw were carried in each day. A broom was placed in a child's hands, and floors were cleared before night. Cleanliness was not decorative, it reduced sickness and accidents. This small chore gave children a sense of control over their environment, reinforcing the principle that order contributed to survival. Carrying wood indoors was one of the most regular duties. Children were rarely asked to split logs, but they were asked to gather kindling or carry smaller pieces. These were stacked near the fire or stove, ready for evening use. The rhythm of this work became habitual. A child would lift, walk, and set down, over and over, until the pile was judged sufficient. Though adults managed the heaviest pieces, children ensured that fuel was always within reach. Learning to mend was also part of childhood. Girls, and sometimes boys, were taught to sew patches, darn stockings, and repair seams. Quilts that had worn thin were stitched again by small fingers under adult supervision. This training occurred in the evenings, by lamplight, when hands were free after chores. It was recognized that without the ability to mend, clothing would fail. Thus, children were instructed patiently, repetition reinforcing skill. Winter also required children to care for one another. Older siblings supervised younger ones while parents worked. They helped them dress, guided them to bed, and ensured they remained covered during the night. This role of caretaking was considered natural, not extraordinary. It was expected that children would extend responsibility beyond themselves. Education was informal but consistent. Parents explained the purpose of each task, not in dramatic speeches, but in simple reminders. A father might say that water was needed so the kettle could be filled. A mother might say that straw was required so the bed could be warmer. Through these remarks, children learned cause and effect. The repetition of explanation created understanding. Games were not absent, but they often resembled chores. A child might pretend to churn butter with a stick, or to cook with imaginary pots, or to herd invisible animals. These imitations reflected the tasks observed daily. In this way, play itself became practice for future responsibilities. Nighttime routines for children also included preparation for bed. They were reminded to put on stockings, to wear caps, and to settle beneath quilts without delay. If they shifted coverings away during sleep, parents or older siblings adjusted them again. The discipline of lying still, of sharing space with others, and of preserving warmth was learned over many nights. Illness in children increased the burden of winter. When a child was feverish, chores shifted to others. Older siblings might take on the tasks of the sick. Parents managed additional work. Neighbors sometimes contributed. The absence of one child's labor was noticed, not because it was large, but because every hand mattered. Recovery was slow, and during recovery, other children compensated. The rhythm of childhood chores was therefore steady. Morning might begin with feeding animals. Afternoon might include sweeping, gathering straw, or carrying water. Evening concluded with carrying wood, tending lamps, and preparing bedding. None of these duties were extraordinary. All were ordinary. All were expected. Discipline was enforced gently but firmly. Neglect of chores could result in discomfort for all. A forgotten bucket meant thirst. A neglected animal meant reduced milk or eggs. A missing bundle of wood meant cold. These consequences taught responsibility more effectively than words. Children learned that the group depended upon the individual, and that the individual's work could not be ignored. In recollections written later, adults remembered the rhythm of their childhood chores without bitterness. They described carrying straw, sweeping floors, fetching water, and patching quilts. They remembered the dim glow of lamps, the weight of wood in small arms, the quiet instructions of parents. These memories were presented without exaggeration, as if such routines were natural and inevitable. In conclusion, the role of children in enduring the coldest nights was neither dramatic nor optional. Children carried water, tended animals, gathered straw, swept floors, trimmed wicks, carried wood, patched garments, supervised siblings, and imitated tasks in play. Through these activities, they became part of the rhythm of survival. Each action was small, but each action was repeated. Each action was modest, but each action was necessary. Through participation, children learned discipline. Through repetition, they gained skill. And through steady contribution, they helped their families endure the long, cold nights of the frontier. It was acknowledged by frontier families that winter nights were not merely cold but also exceptionally long. The length of night itself shaped daily life. In the deep months of the season, darkness stretched for 12, 13, or even 14 hours. The duration of these hours required patience. The management of such time was as important as the maintenance of warmth. To live through the coldest nights was to live through time itself, measured slowly, hour by hour, until morning returned. Inside cabins, silence was the dominant condition. Once chores had been completed, once meals had been eaten, and once bedding had been arranged, there was little left to occupy the hours. Light was faint, and resources for creating light were limited. Candles were consumed quickly, oil for lamps was precious, and firewood was reserved primarily for heat. Therefore, activity diminished as night deepened. The household grew quiet, not by choice alone but by necessity. Sleep during these nights did not always follow a single unbroken span. It was often segmented. Families might retire early, soon after dusk, then awaken in the middle of the night for a period of quiet wakefulness, before sleeping again until dawn. This pattern was not considered unusual. It was a rhythm formed by the length of winter darkness. During the waking interval, small tasks were performed. Embers were stirred, water was sipped, prayers were spoken, or quiet conversation was exchanged. Then, when drowsiness returned, sleep resumed. This segmented sleep was repeated winter after winter, so often that it became expected rather than exceptional. The atmosphere of night inside the cabin was shaped by the fire. The glow of embers lit the room faintly, shadows stretching across walls. The sound of crackling persisted, softer as logs diminished. Families adjusted their bodies beneath quilts and hides, shifting occasionally but not rising often. Movement was minimal, for the preservation of heat required stillness. Thus, the hours passed slowly, marked only by the settling of wood, the faint sigh of wind outside, and the breathing of sleepers. Dreams were noted in recollections but not analyzed. People accepted them as part of long nights. Some dreams reflected daily labor, others reflected memory, and others faded upon waking. The repetition of segmented sleep may have encouraged more vivid dreams, yet little was recorded. Families regarded them as private, not as subjects for long discussion. Outside the cabin, the night was deeper still. Snow reflected moonlight, but where trees stood thick, darkness was nearly complete. The sounds of winter nights were sparse. The call of an owl, the crack of a branch, the distant howl of wolves, these were the few interruptions. Families lying awake beneath quilts might hear such sounds faintly. They were reminders of the wilderness beyond the walls, reminders of the necessity of staying within, protected by shelter and fire. Children experienced winter nights differently from adults. For them, the length of darkness felt endless. They often fell asleep quickly, warmed by shared bedding, but they also woke restlessly. Parents comforted them, adjusted blankets, or spoke softly until sleep returned. In this way, children learned patience, learned stillness, and learned the habit of passing long hours without complaint. The night was also a time of vulnerability. If sickness struck, it often became apparent in the dark hours. A cough, a fever, or a sudden pain disturbed sleep. Parents kept watch, sometimes rising to prepare simple remedies by lamplight. These events added weight to the night, yet they were endured as part of the rhythm of survival. Some families used the hours of night to engage in quiet reflection. Adults considered the supplies that remained, calculated how many weeks of food were left, and planned tasks for the following day. Others prayed, their voices low, asking for endurance. Still others sat silently, listening to the fire. The night provided time, and time was filled with such modest occupations. When nights were exceptionally cold, additional precautions were taken. Children might be moved closer together. Extra clothing might be pulled onto beds. Water containers were checked to ensure they had not frozen solid. These adjustments required little effort but brought reassurance. Once completed, families settled again into silence. The passage of hours was not marked by clocks, for clocks were rare. Instead, the progress of night was measured by instinct, by the dimming of embers, or by the feel of rest within the body. Morning was anticipated not by exact time but by the gradual return of pale light through shutters or cracks. When morning approached, routines resumed. Embers were uncovered, logs were added, and water was heated. The long night ended not suddenly but gradually, as daylight spread. Families rose, stretched, and prepared to begin another day. The memory of the night was not preserved as an event, because each night resembled the one before it. The sameness was accepted. The repetition was survival. In conclusion, the long winter nights of the frontier were endured through patience, segmented sleep, quiet reflection, and silence. Families lay beneath quilts, children learned stillness, adults watched over embers, and hours passed in darkness. There was little noise, little light, little variety. Yet in this lack of variety lay the very rhythm that made endurance possible.